Hi there, my name is Scott Larson, and I am the creator of the independent comic book series Visitations. Visitations is the history of Chicago as seen through the eyes of the residents of the city's oldest cemetery. I've been interviewing different comic book professionals for the past few months, and today I wanted to interview Andrew Pepoy, who has done a little bit of everything. He's worked for Marvel, he's worked for DC, he worked on the Little Orphan Annie comic strip for Tribune Media a number of years ago. And he is somebody who I actually met very briefly in college, although he doesn't remember that. And I served as his assistant for a number of years doing something called spotting, which is putting the blacks into different pages that he was inking. So when he would ink something, the line work would be there, and then I would color in all the little blacks. So I'm going to bring him on to talk to you. And we'll be starting in just a second. Okay, hi Andrew, how are you?
Hey, hi Scott, I'm doing fine. How about you today?
I'm doing good. Thanks so much for coming on, I really appreciate it. And one thing I forgot to mention about Andrew real quick is he has a Kickstarter going on right now. And we'll talk about that a little bit more near the end of the program. But first, before I start asking you any questions, is there anything that I missed while I was...
I mean, you know, like you said, I've done a little bit of everything. So yeah, I mean, it's quite a long list, and I'm sure we'll touch on some of it as we're talking about this today. But yeah, you know, been doing this this year makes 31 years professionally, so a long time. And you know, like you said, Marvel, DC, Dark Horse, Archie, Simpsons, you name it. And so it's been, you know, it's been a fun life doing lots and lots of comic books.
So,
and like oh, go ahead.
No, please.
No, and like you said, and comic strips, you know, Little Orphan Annie, and then last year I got to be guest artist on the Dick Tracy newspaper strip for a little bit too.
Oh, that's really neat. I don't think I realized that. So you've done a little bit of everything. What's your first memory of something comic book related, whether it was like the old Batman TV show, or it was comic strips or a comic book? What's the first thing you can remember?
I mean, the first stuff I remember certainly as a little kid is either watching Super Friends on a Saturday morning, you know, because I mean that started in the mid 70s probably.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, so I certainly remember watching that. But maybe even before that, yeah, watching the Batman TV show and reruns after school back when I was a kid in Ohio. Before, you know, and so this would have been probably 1974, 75, something like that. And I remember coming home and yeah, that'd be what I'd be watching, was the old Adam West Batman show. And I know even at that point, you know, I must have liked superheroes because I had some of those Mego 8-inch action figures. You know, I had Superman, I had you know, Captain Marvel, you know, the Shazam Captain Marvel, and you know, coloring books of Superman and all that. So I was probably into the superheroes already at that point, though I was not buying comic books yet at that point.
Now, what came first, comic strips or comic books?
Probably comic strips, I would say. I mean, you know, like at least as far as anything I was buying actively, because I mean, sure, I know I picked up the occasional Richie Rich or Sad Sack comic as a kid, but certainly the first thing I ever was like actively collecting and buying were the Peanuts little paperbacks that they were doing back then, reprinting the newspaper strips. I remember I bought my first one of those in second grade. You know, through one of those little, you know, book club of the month things they used to give you, those little fill out forms, and I bought one that was simply called Snoopy, and that was the first one I bought. And from that point on, I was like Peanuts mad. I was buying all the little Peanuts books and getting little stuffed Peanuts toys and all, and that's what really began to get me into comics in general. Was that. And so then yeah, I know from that I started reading the comics page in the paper in Holland, Michigan, where I grew up. You know, every day I was you know, faithfully reading, you know, the little comic section there.
So Peanuts was your favorite?
Oh yeah. I mean, Peanuts is still, you know, one of the best of the best. You know, I love Peanuts. You can actually like see behind some of the Peanuts, you know, collection volumes that they did not long ago, and you know, on the wall across from me, you can't see it, but you know, I've got like, you know, Peanuts art and stuff. So it's yeah, no, I mean, yeah, you know, I'd say Charles Schultz, not just as, you know, for the work, but just the what he brought through in the strips was a huge influence, even just on the way I look at life and all that, you know, and starting at such a young age, you know, you just sort of picked up on some of that. And so, yeah, so Charles Schultz is still one of my absolute heroes. It's one of my great regrets that I never got to meet him. You know, like you mentioned Little Orphan Annie. When I first got the Little Orphan Annie job, one of the first things I did was I was then able to join the National Cartoonist Society, because I was doing a newspaper show. I mean, yes, you could join as a comic book artist, but it was certainly much easier as a newspaper cartoonist. And you know, and I was like, oh, good, now I can go to the convention and I can meet Charles Schultz. Unfortunately, you know, Schultz did not live to, you know, make it to that convention, my very first convention. But you know, so it's always been a regret that I never actually got to meet him.
And then, so yeah, I do want to talk a little bit more about comic strips too, because you had because you had done the Little Orphan Annie thing, and I'm curious as to what your feelings were on that. But before we do that, what was the first comic book you ever got? Do you remember that?
I mean, the first one I can.
The occasional Sad Sack.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, the occasional Richie Rich or Sad Sack I know I picked up. Is, you know, like as far as a specific comic, I remember this must have been, you know, right when the Wonder Woman TV show was starting, you know, so about 1976, 77. My mom gave, well, she was going to stick it in my Christmas stocking apparently, but I found it by chance, you know, earlier where she'd hidden it. And, you know, so an issue of Wonder Woman that guest starred the Elongated Man. So I don't remember the exact issue number, but I remember that about it. And so, yeah, that would have been like my first superhero book that I remember getting. And then, you know, probably not long after that, you know, the first superhero comic I ever went out and bought for my own money was Wonder Woman number 229. I know the issue number on that one at this point. That I remember my dad taking me down to the little newsstand in downtown Holland, Michigan, there to go plop down my 30 cents in those days for a comic book so I could go buy one. And yeah, you know, I was probably, you know, 10 years old, you know, maybe not even 10 years old at the time. So.
Do you still have that comic book?
Oh, of course. And in fact, actually, Jen gave me as a gift a little keychain rack that's over by the front door with the cover of that issue on it. Mm-hmm. You know, I've always remembered that cover. It's always been burned into my brain as one of my favorite covers of all time. I've even done a couple homages to it with other things. So I did a series of Doctor Who covers that unfortunately never saw print. Some of them got solicited, so people have seen some. But yeah, I did a Doctor Who cover that was an homage to that cover, where I swapped out Wonder Woman with Amy Pond and had the Doctor peering in through the glass as she's about to be, you know, blown up with a missile and stuff like that. So I did that homage to it. Or for Jose Luis Garcia Lopez's 70th birthday, a bunch of professionals all did drawings for him, inspired by his work. And that Jose drew that cover way back when. And so so it was a cover by Jose. And so, yeah, I did a Simone and Ajax, my own characters, homage to it, with Simone wearing the Wonder Woman costume and Ajax, you know, being aghast that she's about to be blown up by a missile. And so, yeah, and I drew that and gave that to Jose for his 70th birthday. So, yeah, it's always been one of my favorites. I love that cover. And so, yeah, I definitely, you know, like I said, that one would be the first one I ever went and plopped my own money down for.
So what got you interested in drawing? What got you interested in doing comics?
Well, I mean, according to my mom, I was drawing little superhero things, you know, even as a little kid, like I said, first grade, watching Batman and Super Friends and stuff like that. But it would have been around fourth grade when Superman the movie came out. And I got sick for a little while. I was home from school for a couple weeks. And my mom bought me a little 3-pack of Superman comics, you know, 3 comics for $1 at the grocery store, and brought them home for me. And, you know, because I really loved that movie. And it's like, oh, and I love the comics. And so she, you know, next time she went to the store, she bought me another 3-pack of comics, and that got me collecting comics. As soon as I was better, I, you know, ride my bike down to a little mini mart and started buying the comics myself. And I know that it didn't take me long to start trying to draw the characters I saw in the comics. I know certainly early on, I discovered the Justice Society of America in a coverless Justice League 100-page special that I found at the little, there's a little antique store near our house that, you know, to keep the kids occupied while the parents look in the antiques, they always kept a stack of comic books there you could buy for like, you know, $a quarter or something. And I picked up that, and I remember drawing every single one of the JSA members that was in that in my horrible little style, or tracing off on that, you know, tracing off the pose on that Superman coloring book I had back in first grade or something like that. You know, very famous Superman painting that we've all seen was on the cover, and just, you know, doing all that. And so, yeah, that, you know, just reading the comics quickly got me into wanting to draw the comics. Mm-hmm. And I started creating my own characters. I know I certainly was attempting to do stuff like that in fifth grade. You know, started drawing my own little superhero comics. I never made it past the third page on any of those early ones. And it certainly surprised my parents when they found out that one day after school, instead of going home, I walked down to the local newspaper in town and tried to convince them to start printing my comic books, you know, when I was like, you know, 11 years old or something like that.
What'd they say?
They were like, no, they couldn't do that, but they seemed to have found it rather cute. So they ran an article on me. They did an article in the paper on me, and, you know, picture me and picture my character called Zap. Yes, you know, I mean, that's, you know, coming up with those great names at that age. I had Zap, and so, yeah, they ran a little article on me. But yeah, it wasn't actually that long after that I actually did finish my first comic. You know, like I said, I just, you know, just had the zeal to do it immediately. And so, yeah, so the summer after sixth grade, when I was 12 years old, they were offering a summer comics art class in Grand Rapids, which was, you know, not that far from us. And my grandmother lived there. So and it was being taught by Mike Gustovich, who, you know, was in the business for a long time. At that time, he was still relatively new, but he was teaching the class. And so, yeah, my mom would just drop me off at my grandma's at the beginning of the week, and I'd go in and take the class twice a week. And that led to me finishing, you know, like, we had to start a project with our own character. And again, that was only 3 pages, but this time I went and finished the whole book. You know, and then my dad snuck me into his office building that he worked at on a weekend, so I could run off the comic book on the office copier, and made my own first little fanzine. So, yeah, that was all by the time I was 12, and, you know, from there on, just kept trying to do it. You know, just started going to little conventions in Grand Rapids. I started setting up at the conventions in Grand Rapids when I was probably 13 years old. You know, and then went and sort of crashed the Chicago Comic-Con when I was 14 in 1983. I remember that I showed up. You know, that was back in the days when your parents would let you hop in, you know, when you're 14, hop in a car with your 16-year-old friends and drive 3 hours to another state to go to a comic book convention. And I brought a box of fanzines, and I brought my own little folding table. And, you know, and so I walked in there and I started asking if I could set up somewhere. And they eventually pointed me to Larry Charette, who, you know, he ran Larry's Comics here in Chicago for many years. And you know, Larry was like, well, if you can find a spot where you're not blocking a fire exit or someone else's exhibit, go ahead. You know, they certainly didn't do that these days, but they were like, go ahead. And I found a little spot, you know, up there on the balcony, or in between Bill Willingham and Mike Sains, and set up my own little table and just sitting there with my fanzines at the 1983 Chicago Comic-Con. I remember Rich Buckler walking up to me at the show and asking, you know, saying to me, it's like, I couldn't get a table. How'd you get a table? And I was like, I brought my own.
So how did you do that show? Did you sell a lot, or?
I sold some. You know, I was also away from my, as I am at even modern shows, I'm away from my table, off being a fan geek, you know, myself, you know, because I'm as much of a fan as I am, you know, even though I've been working in the business for 30 years, I'm still just as much of a fan as I ever have been. So I was off talking to people and things like that. I remember, you know, taking a whole stack of books over to John Byrne to get signed. Had long chats with Trevor Von Eden and Tim Truman and all that at that show. I remember, you know, Jose. You know, I met Jose Luis Garcia Lopez at that show. He was very nice to me, though. At that, you know, his English is still not great, but his you know, was even, you know, it was hard to have a conversation, but we attempted it, and he was very kind to me, and I've always appreciated that he at least he tried to talk with me and point out things about my drawings. And I mean, and coming from Jose, who pretty much, he may not be the household name in the business, but among the professionals, we all know he's like the best of the best. You know, he can outdraw all of us. He's just amazing. So it was So yes, I know I sold some fanzines. I know I had some there, and I did manage to sell a few. But for me, my biggest memories of that show are off talking to all these professionals. This is my very first. I've been to a few small shows in Grand Rapids, but this is my very first big show. So it was just, I remember walking into the lobby, the hotel as we just got there, and it's like, I'd seen pictures of Marv Wolfman in fanzines and stuff, and it's like, oh look, it's Marv Wolfman, holy cow, so.
So I'm curious. Okay, so I have more questions about that, but I want to take a step back. So you started doing comic conventions in Michigan. How old were you? 13, you said?
Yeah, maybe even 12. I had just turned, like, I did a, it's sort of like, you've heard that old saying, let's do it, out of the old Mickey Rooney movies, let's do a play in the backyard. Well, it was like, this friend of mine, Tom McGovern, who I'm still friends with to this day, all these years later. We met in the Mike Gustovich class in 1981, and we're still friends. And he decided, and he was younger than me. He was like 10. And he decided, let's have a comic book convention in my garage. And we did, and we had a bunch, we actually had a fair number of people show up.
Mm-hmm.
And like I set up and he set up and other people we knew who had comic books to sell all set up. And that's what I produced my first fanzine for, was doing that. So so I did that little show. And there were these little conventions in Grand Rapids that actually would, usually have one or two, they bring in one or two like name pros. And early, Tardy, who ran the show, was, he was supportive of the local fanzine people. I was like the first one who I guess tried to set up at his shows, and he let me in. Soon there was eventually there was usually a little row of fanzine people at his shows, because people started finding out, they could actually come to their shows and he'd give you space to set up. So yeah, I was 12, 13, 14. I was doing those shows all through high school.
So what were they charging for tables?
They didn't charge me for a table.
Okay.
Yeah, they just wanted to be supportive of the local scene. I mean, in those early days, like Larry, even at the early Chicago cons, those days in the 80s, Larry wasn't charging us for tables. Mm-hmm. And in fact, I mean, he was very supportive of the fanzine crowd too. He had a little fanzine area we could set up. At least at least early on, they weren't charging for tables. I think eventually they were, but he even gave us a suite to hang out in at night. There was like a little room he gave us that the fanzine people could just hang out in at nights. I don't know if that was to keep us all from bothering all the other guests, but yeah, it was. I was doing fanzines for years, having a lot of fun doing them, and met a lot of people that way. And that's, in some ways, that's how I started building the network of contacts I had that eventually I was able to draw upon when I was ready to actually break into the business.
That's amazing. So I was going to ask you something else about Larry. Oh, so where was that Chicago Comic-Con? Where was that? I'm assuming it wasn't in Rosemont.
No, that very first one was at the Americana Congress Hotel downtown that I went to. That would have been the summer of 1983. And then I didn't get to come back in 84, but I came back in 85. And by that time, it had moved out to the Ramada out in Rosemont. And again, I was standing, even at that point, even at those 83 and 85 shows, I was already standing in the portfolio lines for the professional companies. It's like I was out there, just, and that, like I said, and it was getting reviews, it was getting advice and criticism, and so that actually really helped doing that at such an early age. And I mean, that's how I met Bob Schreck in like 1983, who I eventually worked with at DC Comics, or who, I didn't work with him when he was at Dark Horse, but he introduced me around and stuff like that. So, I was doing the networking I was doing networking at conventions by the time I was 14.
So, about that. So you're talking networking, and the first thing that pops to mind is that you're talking to professionals. But I sat in on one of your panels, and I think it was, I believe it was when we were in San Diego together, and you gave a panel about networking, and you told us, other than just like trying to get into professionals, you were talking to everybody.
Oh yeah.
You're talking about the people. So talk a little bit about that. So when you were at these conventions, when you were like 12, 13, 14 years old, and you said that you were walking around and leaving your table, which, you do now as well. before I ask this question, did you have someone watching your tables then?
No, I mean, I usually just, I mean, I at that point, I would just pull the stuff that was on my tiny, I had, like basically my table was about as big as a TV tray, so I mean, there wasn't much on it. So it was pretty easy to just pull it off it and just set it on the wall behind my chair, set it by the wall behind my chair. And that, so yeah, I would just stash the stuff there and go off and wander. And yeah, like I said, I was talking to, either the professionals, I was talking to other wannabe artists. I remember at that very first 1983 show, I met Jill Thompson, and who was still, at that point, still a kid herself and trying to break in, and just talking to whoever was willing to talk to me, whether they were, publishers or other artists. And yeah, I met other fanzine people at these shows as well, other wannabe artists, because some of them would see me there and they're like, oh, how, again, they'd be like, there you are with your fanzines. And that's how I met, that's how I met Tim Eldred at a show who, we met at one of these little Grand Rapids shows where I had a little table and he was doing fanzines. So he set up at the next show. And I ended up doing some fanzine stuff with him, on his books. He ended up doing some stuff on mine. And actually that was how I got my really big break into comics. Was I ran into Tim at another show. We hadn't been doing fanzines together for a few years, but I ran into him at a show and he was starting to do stuff at Malibu at that point in the late 80s and needed an inker for his new series and was like, hey, you used to ink me on these fanzines. You want to try out for this? So I tried out and got the job. So that was the beginning of my inking career.
Mm-hmm. So when you so you left there and you came to Chicago and you started going to Loyola University.
Right, that would have been 1987.
Right. So and I want to mention something about that real quick. So in 1992, and this is a little bit about me that I don't really talk too much about, I had decided that I had always loved comics and I always wanted to get into the business. And I had decided in 1992 that that's when I was going to do it. And everyone kept talking to me at the university, because I went to Loyola University as well. And they kept talking about Andrew Pepoy. And the thing was, I had met Andrew, but I didn't know the face along with the name. I just knew him by sight. And he had done something for the university art magazine. And it was actually a Simone and Ajax, like 2-pager. And I had torn the pages out and I stuck them up on my wall. So when I was drawing, I had your stuff up on my wall because I knew that you had gone in a similar direction that I had. Actually, you were a lot different than I was, but you had gone to the same school and you had been a professional at that point. And actually at that point, you had already gotten your first job at DC. But Andrew's stuff was helpful for me because it gave me something to look at and it gave me a direction to go in. And so it's curious to see how many people that you affected like that, because my guess is it probably isn't just me. But you were going to school at Loyola when you got your first job at DC, correct?
Right, yeah. Well, like I got my first professional job the summer between sophomore and junior year. I sold a couple short bits to Gary Reed at Caliber Press. So Gary had first contacted me a few years earlier. But I was like 16 years old, had just, started driving, just started dating. And that's about when my fanzine production and just comics production sort of, slowed down dramatically because I was having some fun, so I didn't really get my act together for stuff with Gary at first, but then eventually I try to pitch him. So my problem back then was I'd be going to these conventions. I was in my early days of college, and I would try to pitch stuff to Gary, and he'd say my stuff was like too commercial. Gary tended to be a little more on the alternative side, and then I would show it to Malibu, and Malibu would say my stuff was too weird. And so I was having a little problem getting stuff there, but eventually I sold 2 pieces to Gary in 1989, and I've lost track of where we started on this. What was?
I was about to ask about DC, but actually I want to back off from that because You know, I had mentioned that I had been your assistant for a little while, but you had been an assistant for somebody else before that as well, correct?
I'd assisted a few people. Yeah, I will never forget my experience assisting one time for a very short amount of time for Hillary Barta. I was not ready for that at all at that point.
And how old were you at that point?
I was in college. I was probably, you know, 19 years old, maybe. So, you know, I mean, I was only, you know, a year or so away from when I was actually starting to get professional work, but I just wasn't ready at that point. I remember going over to Hillary's. He was inking an issue of Power Pack. And the issue was an homage to George McManus and Winsor McCay in many ways. So there was all this fancy architectural stuff going on in there. And I went over there with my leaky little tech pens and did a terrible job. And, you know, Hillary, after, you know, a couple hours, you know, just sort of, you know, gave me $20 and drove me home. But yeah, that, you know, I mean, and Hillary and I are great friends these days. So he's not held it against me that when I was a kid, I did a terrible job assisting. But then later, Bill Reinhold called me up, and I did for him what you were doing for me, which is the spotting blacks. He was doing the Punisher at the time, and so yeah, I was erasing pencil lines and filling in blacks on this. I remember it was like a Punisher meets Moon Knight issue. I think it was an annual, and at the same time, Linda was coloring Bill's stuff on a graphic novel he had previously finished with the Punisher. And in those days, on like things where you needed the fancier coloring, it wasn't computer. You would be coloring on blue lines or gray lines. They do a blue or gray line printout and then an acetate overlay, and you would actually be going in with paint to color that in, so you'd have more of a painted effect than you could get out of standard comic book coloring at that time. So I ended up assisting Bill, and then I also ended up assisting Linda, filling in, like when she had larger areas of a flat color to fill in, I'd be doing a lot of that, you know, on like a submarine or some kind of background or something like that. So yeah, so I assisted Hillary, Barta, Bill Reinhold, and Linda Lessman.
And then you had an interview with DC, or you were going in for an interview in New York, correct?
Mm. Yeah, well, like I said, so summer between sophomore and I mean, between junior and senior year is when I got the job inking my friend Tim on Alien.
Real quick.
Yeah.
So that first job you did, were you just inking, or were you penciling as well?
What, for Caliber?
Yeah.
Those one of them both of them I penciled and inked entirely.
Okay.
And one of them I wrote. They were just little one pagers. Okay.
So real quick, because I know we started a story, but I'm pulling you back a little bit.
Sure.
So you've been inking for all of this time. What were your intentions originally? Were you intending to be an inker? Or were you intending to do pencils? Were you intending to do all of it? What and where did that? How did that go? I mean, what did that path look like from where you started to?
You know, I always wanted to write and draw my own stuff, but I was open to trying, you know, whatever came along, you know, just to try to get my, you know, foot in the door in the business. And I mean, I actually had my first inking tryout when I was 16. Rick Hoberg tried me out to ink Trinity Smith, which he was doing at either Heroic or Renegade at that point. It was at both publishers, so I don't know what period that was at this point. But I remember him trying me out when I was 16. So, I mean, I hadn't planned on being an inker, but, you know, there I was at 16 doing a tryout. And again, even later, when these other jobs came along, like I said, I'd done my couple little things for Caliber. I had just come back from a semester in Europe. I had all these dreams of doing these, you know, graphic novels like they were doing over there, writing and drawing these books. And, you know, it was a little too full of myself in many ways, trying to do these more, you know, some of these. And, you know, but I got to that show, and at that show, like I said, I ran into Tim, and Tim was like, "Hey, yeah, you know, you want to try inking?" It's like, okay, sure. And at that same show, I'm always showing, like I said, I was always showing my portfolio around. So I showed it to Diana Light at Innovation, and she you know, even though there weren't actual inking samples in there, she looked at my work and said, "Hey, looks like you'd be a good inker. Do you want to try inking?" So two people, same show, saying you want to try inking. So yeah, so I did the tryout for Innovation. I did the tryout for the Malibu job. my mom and dad sprung for a plane ticket to me to San Diego. That back in those days, you know, it was in a hotel ballroom. It was certainly not the San Diego Comic-Con we all know these days. And, you know, you could just go in there and buy a ticket and go in back then. You know, they certainly can't do that anymore. But yeah, so I flew out there and went into the show and showed my stuff to Innovation and didn't get the job, and showed my stuff to Malibu and they gave me the job. So I wasn't planning on being an inker. I wanted to write and draw my own stuff, or at least be drawing more, but the inking came along and it took off and I got the job inking Tim. So I spent most of my senior year going to school, but, you know, also inking this mini series for Malibu at the same time. And so and I mean, nothing polished up my inking skills faster than actually having to produce finished books. You know, like, you know, I've been doing all sorts of little odds and ends before, but by having to sit down and ink entire 25-page comic books, you know, on a deadline, that certainly polished up my skills quickly. And so, yeah, so my spring break of senior year, using, again, contacts I'd made at different shows at different times and friends I'd made either through fanzines or whatever, I was able to get appointments at both DC and Marvel. And yeah, and very first time trying, I was amazingly lucky. Well, actually DC, it almost turned into a disaster. It was kind of a good story. So Michael Davis, who later went on to help found Milestone, I had met him while I was at the airport waiting to fly home from San Diego the previous summer. And I didn't even know he was there. He was peering over my shoulders. I was talking to some kid there while we were waiting to board the flights, and he was peering over my shoulder looking at my work. And so afterwards he's like, hey, if you ever, it's like, here's my card, if you ever need some help, getting in, talking to people at DC or whatever, let me know. So yeah, so he actually helped set up an appointment for me at DC with an editor named Katie Main. She was supposed to introduce me around to the other people. And so I get to DC, I've never been to New York before in my life, and I'm sitting there in the DC waiting room. The receptionist sends me back to Kate, Katie. Between the time I left reception and got to Katie, emergency family phone call. Katie comes out of her office. She's like, sorry, I can't, I have to leave. I can't see you. And I'm just left standing there in the hallway in DC Comics, not knowing anybody and wondering what do I do now, when Brian Augustin walked out of his office, next door, and saw this confused looking kid standing there, asked me what I was doing there. He took pity on me and looked at my portfolio and gave me the Flash Annual. I think it helped that I was from Chicago too, because he was from Chicago. There was quite a Chicago contingent at DC at that point. There were a lot of people who had come from Chicago. And so I think the fact that I was from Chicago, helped in that aspect. But yeah, it's like I walked out there with the Flash Annual. So yeah, last part of senior year, there I was going to school and at the same time inking the Flash. And I left Marvel with a Punisher pinup to ink. I didn't, certainly not on the scale of the DC job, but I still walked out of Marvel with a job to ink. Mm-hmm. So I was very, very lucky.
So talk a little bit about that Flash Annual. I remember when that annual came out. I was a big fan of the Flash at the time, and that was 1991. Yeah. And I can remember because it came out in August of 91. When were you working on that? Was it like January or?
No. I mean, you remember spring break back in school was probably like March. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, so I started working on it in April, probably. I remember getting my first FedEx box full of penciled pages, because back then, we weren't scanning things and printing them out blue lines. They just you FedExed everything back and forth. And so yeah, I remember that first box of pencil pages getting to me, and it was like, wow, I was like, thinking, wow, this is just the greatest thing, because it's like I'm working on real comics, and these are real pencils, on the Flash, and there was a panel with Batman and Superman and Wonder Woman in it. And it's like, holy cow, it's like I'm getting to do stuff with like these characters.
That was page 1.
No, that wasn't page 1, but it was.
You sure about that?
Yeah, I remember page 1. The Flash wasn't even on page 1. I don't think.
I have it back there, but
okay.
Then it was like page 2 or page 3. It was like right there in the front. So how scary was that?
I remember being a little daunted. Just, it took me a little while before I could, it certainly wasn't like, oh, I'm opening this up and I'm immediately going to start slapping ink on these pages. No, I'm, you know, it took me, you know, maybe another day before I was ready to actually start inking anything. But I don't know. I mean, I guess I knew it was a job and it had to be done. I mean, I'm like backtracking even further. As a kid, the first real cartoonist I ever knew was this cartoonist named Rick Yeager, who had drawn the Buck Rogers newspaper strip from 1933 to 58 and had done many other things as well. And I may not have been influenced so much by his style, but I was influenced by his work ethic. And it's just sort of like, you have a job, you get the job done. You meet that deadline, it happens. You know, you know, it's like, you just have to get it done. And so I may have been daunted for, you know, a day before I started inking that stuff, but it's like, no, it's a job. And I knew it's like, it's a deadline that had to be met. And this is my big chance, and I was not going to blow it. So I just sat down and started inking it. I mean, I look back on it now and I'm like, I can't imagine why they gave me a job at that point, but they did. And so, yeah, I got it done, and it led to more work. Brian gave me a Justice League quarterly, 36 pager right after that. So, and I did an issue of Starman. And so, yeah, that led to me doing a whole bunch of other jobs. So.
And now in those early days, were you taking a look at, so, and I'll put it in the context. So when I'm drawing, I usually have a million different comic books like spread out on my drawing board. I've got them on the side, I'm looking, and you know, I'm getting ideas, or I'm taking a look to see how this artist did that, or how that artist did that. Were you using any kind of reference like that? Were you like, oh, hey, how did Alex Raymond do this, or was it just, I'm just doing this and then we'll see how it goes?
I mean, if I'm drawing something, then yeah, I'll have you know, so I'm trying to do something especially more realistic. If I'm drawing something, you know, yeah, I've got my Alex Raymond Flash Gordon book. I've got my Mark Schultz Xena's Oak Tales. I got my Dave Stevens Rocketeer. You know, those three can usually be found there from doing something like that. But as far as with inking goes, you know, I might glance at what somebody else was doing to ink a certain penciler to try to get an idea what to do with them. But you know, a lot of, with comics, it's just sort of like, it's a tight deadline. Usually it's late by the time it gets to the inker, and you just have to sit down and do it. Because at that point, it's, you know, the writer had a chance to be late, the penciler had a chance to be late, the letterer had a chance to be late. You always have to feel sorry for the colorist, because the colorist is always waiting on the inker, and boy, they have no time to do anything. But yeah, I mean, there wasn't the time to be always looking at a bunch of stuff. It's just sort of like you had to use your gut instinct as to what was the best way to ink this in many cases. I mean, yeah, once in a while I'd go look at, you know, how somebody else handled it, but I probably didn't have it just sitting there by me. I just had to like sit down and put in the hours at the board and get those pages done. I mean, that's comics. That's you know, it's just, you just have to get them done.
And then, so you're talking a little bit about all the comic people from Chicago at DC Comics. And I know about this group, and there were quite a bit of them at that particular time. What was that like? Were you able to interact with those people when you were still here? I mean, when you were in the city, like when you weren't going off to conventions or anything, were you meeting with the Chicago comic book community?
What, the ones who worked at DC? Like, I mean, because
yeah,
there were a lot of editors. There were actually, when I was saying there was a Chicago presence at DC, I'm actually talking about in the editorial department.
Okay.
You know, I mean, there was a Chicago comic scene as well, but I mean, even editorially at DC, there was this Chicago contingent of Brian Augustin and Mike Gold and Kim Yale, and I'm trying to remember who else, but there were some others, you know, who were all from Chicago, so that actually did help. And certainly but I mean, yeah, there was a Chicago comics professional scene. I mean, even before I broke in, I had met people like Paul Mounts and Tony Akins, who were working at Now Comics at the time. At these there used to be these little conventions in a church basement that I would go to on a Saturday afternoon, and they were usually guests there, and I would meet them. So I knew a few people locally as well, like I said, Bill Reinhold, Linda, but it actually wasn't until I started getting to work at DC that I really started meeting more of the local Chicago people. Like Larry at Larry's Comics arranged for me to go out to lunch with Len Straczewski and Mike Parabek, who I'd never met before, but they, you know, we all met up at the shop and, you know, got to meet them. And yeah, as soon as I was in the business, then somehow I just ended up starting to meet a lot of the other people who were, you know, like at the time, Steve Darnall and Alex Ross and other people like that who were just starting to break in at the time as well.
So when you were around those people, obviously you talked about all kinds of different things, but was there any kind of inspiration that you got from anyone in particular in that group? So let's say Mike Parabek was talking about something and you listened to what he had to say and you're like, oh, hey, maybe I could use that. Or maybe, hey, Mike, I have this idea for that. Because I knew Mike Parabek as well. And he would show me artwork all the time. And there was one point where he had pulled out, he had done this Batman Superman animated series magazine. And he had shown me the last page and he's like, what do you think of this? What do you think of the perspective on this? And I actually thought it was fine. And I told him what I thought. And at the time, I wasn't anywhere near a professional, but I was looking at comics all the time. And then by the time it got printed, he had completely changed it. And I knew it because I saw what the original looked like. So did you find yourself in situations like that, or where you would say you got together with a group of people where they would look at your stuff and make suggestions, or did any of that kind of stuff happen?
Not so much. Like we'd have stuff, and certainly I seem to be one of the few inkers locally at the time. Most everyone else was either writers or pencilers. And I seem to be one of the few inkers. So, Bill Reinhold, even though he was more known as a penciler at that point, was usually inking his own stuff. So he would, he would look at my stuff and make suggestions. And I was always grateful to get it. He was very helpful to me when I was a kid. He even did a fanzine cover for me. He did a cover for one of my fanzines when I was like 14 years old. And so he was always helpful. But we actually had a lot of gatherings. There was I can't remember, there's the Chicago Comics Collective something that we'd have these little monthly meetings that it would rotate from one person's house to another in the early 90s, and we would get together. But I don't remember there being a whole lot of critiquing each other's work. It was more just sort of like talking about this or that in comics, talking about who's doing, what publishers are doing what in general, just in general what you were doing, or if there was some new publisher or some new project that you might be interested in or something. But yeah, I don't remember a whole lot of people critiquing each other's stuff at that point. And and like I said, there might have been more of that if I was working more on pencils at that point, but the inking just took off for me. I was very, very lucky. I was inking full time from the moment I graduated from college. And so I didn't have time to do a whole lot of penciling. So I was just inking whatever came along, and just going after that next job, and, ended up doing some Iron Man issues or some Spider-Man stuff or whatever,
So what I want to do now, and thanks, that's really interesting. What I want to ask you now is I want to ask you about the stage play you did about a decade ago, or the people who did the stage play that you were involved in.
Okay. Well, yeah, that was actually the Chicago Tap Theater, and they're still around. They're well-known, internationally recognized tap dance group headed by Mark Yonley. And Mark is cousins with Andy Parks. Mm-hmm. And so I guess apparently he'd gone to Andy and it's like, do you know anyone in Chicago who would, maybe want to work with us on doing a superhero tap dance opera? And when I say superhero tap dance opera, it's not a singing type show. It's like a tap opera is the stories told entirely in tap, in dance, through dance. And so, so I said, well, that sounds interesting. I love the old movie musicals and Ann Miller tap dancing and stuff like that. So I'll talk with them. And yeah, it was fun. I ended up working with Mark. We co-wrote a plot for the show, and I designed the costumes, at least on a sketch. Somebody else, helped flesh them out, but and I did set sketches and all that as well. So they ended up doing the show here. I don't even know what year that was at this point.
It was 2008.
Was it?
Yeah.
Okay. For some reason, it felt like it was longer ago than that. But yeah, so we did the show, and then by chance, so I got approached by a guy. Apparently somebody at DC had recommended me to him. I can't remember who, but was recommended to this other producer who was a show producer in New York and was trying to do a TV pilot and needed some comic book artwork to go with it, and to try to help sell the pilot apparently. And so I started talking with him, and apparently what his day, we got talking, and what his day job was running the New York Musical Theater Festival. So I said to him, well, funny thing is I've got this show. So, because the first run of it was happening at that time. So I got this show. So we got to talking about it. And usually most of the shows at the New York Musical Theater Festival were from that region, from New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, stuff like that. Nothing from very far. But they invited us to come and be part of it the next year. So Mark and I, after doing it the first time, reworked the show a little bit to try to improve on it. Made some better sets, made some some various changes to it, and so that turned out to be the first show they ever did for 2 seasons. So that we did the revised version the next season, and then took that version off to New York, where it got 2 performances, not on Broadway, but within sight of Broadway. If I stood out in front of the theater it played in, I could see Broadway, and we hoped that maybe it might get picked up for a New York production, because that's part of what the New York Musical Theater Festival did, was people would check out different shows from the area and see if it's something they could expand into something in New York City. And so, so it had 2 performances. Unfortunately, didn't get picked up, but it still was a great experience getting to be part of something so different yet still tied in with what I did. So yeah, it was called The Hourglass and the Stop Time Chronicles. I think we changed the title. I can't remember if that was the first year or second year title. It was still called The Hourglass, but we tweaked the title a little bit one of the years. But and the fact that a show that I co-wrote and helped design got to go and play in New York, at least it's like that. How many people can say that? So it's just a really cool thing that I got to try doing. And I'm still in touch. Oh, go ahead. What?
No, I thought that show was really fantastic. I mean, I told you at the time. Mm-hmm. But I obviously I remember it.
Yeah.
I thought it was pretty cool. I've got two things real quick, and then sure. and then I'm gonna let you go. The first thing is I want you to talk a little bit about Annie. But after that, I would like you to segue into Simone and Ajax and tell us a little bit about that, and then sure. talk about your Kickstarter a little bit.
Okay.
So how did the Annie job come along?
Like I said, there's always a lot of networking in comics, and certainly at that point, this would have been early 2000, I think. I don't think it started. I don't think this began in late '99, but certainly that winter, early 2000. I think I'd heard that from somebody that Leonard Starr was retiring, because back then, pre-internet, pre-email. We were everyone I know was on the phone all the time. My phone bills were, at that time, my long distance bills were $300 a month, because I'd be on the phone talking to people all the time. And that's how you found out about what was going on in different opportunities. So somebody tipped me off that Leonard Starr was retiring from Annie. And I had no idea who to even contact down at the Tribune, but I knew it was the Tribune here in Chicago that owned Annie and was the syndicate for it. So I just started, like I said, it was early days of the internet, so you could still search a little something on like Jeeves or whatever it was they used back then. So I managed to find a couple phone numbers, or I just called the Tribune switchboard at the time as well and just asked to talk to somebody. So I ended up leaving a few messages for some people, and eventually, somehow my messages must have gotten passed on. Eve Becker, who was one of the editors at Tribune Media, called me up and said, she'd heard I'd been trying to get a hold of her. So I talked to her, and she invited me to come down and chat with her and show her my stuff. And so I did. And so they asked me to do some samples. And I know there were some other people competing for the job at the same time, but somehow I think what sealed the deal with me for them was like, they looked at my samples, the first round of samples I did, I did them very much like Leonard Starr. And then they said, well, here, make them a little more like your stuff. So I did them a little bit more like my stuff, but I was still drawing traditional Annie with that haircut and all that you're used to seeing her in. And they were like, then they had me down there showing my stuff, not just to her, but to a group of people at Tribune. And so I remember we're sitting at a conference, like a round conference table, And they were like, can you, we need to do a little update. And right there and then on the spot, I did, like, just on some lined notebook paper, a little sketch of Annie, pulling her hair back into a ponytail, and some slightly more modern clothes at that time, with, like, being at that period, these sort of flared pants that the people were wearing. And they looked at it, and that's, I think, what got me the job. Is, I gave them what they were looking for on the spot with an updated Annie. So yeah, so I've been very, very lucky, and again, it's also, I'm known for being persistent. So it's like, a lot of people would have been like, I don't know anyone at Tribune, I can't do this. It's like, I don't know anyone at Tribune, I'm going to just leave I'm just going to leave, like 3 or 4 messages for various people who may have nothing to do with this, just in case, because that's the thing with a lot of these jobs is you, unless you try, you're not going to get it. So I have always gone in with the attitude of, it's worth a shot. So more times than not, I get shot down. It's like for every job I get, I've probably been shot down half a dozen times, but it's always worth making that effort just in case. And in that case, yeah, it led to me doing Annie. Now, I didn't do Annie for very long for various reasons, but it's still a great thing to be able to say, I did, one of the most famous newspaper strips of all time for a year. And I got to redesign Annie. And I mean, I still have people coming up to me. I mean, it's been 20 years, since I did Annie. And I still have people coming up to me. It's like, so you're still doing Annie? So people still remember that I was doing that. It got a lot of press coverage, which was nice. And, yeah, and it was fun to get to do it. And then like I said, last summer, I got to have another little dip into the newspaper strip, field where Joe Staten, who draws the Dick Tracy newspaper strip, once or twice a year, I want to take a little vacation. And so they will bring in a guest artist to draw the Dick Tracy newspaper strip for a couple of weeks. So yeah, so last summer, I got to draw a 2-week segment of Dick Tracy, and we're allowed to use any of the Tribune characters. It doesn't just have to be a Dick Tracy character. So like say for example, they had brought in Little Orphan Annie. They like after I left Little Orphan Annie, it still went on for several more years with other people, but it ended up sort of leaving on a cliffhanger. And so Joe and Mike Curtis, the writer he works with on there, decided to pick up what happened to Annie, and Dick Tracy solves the mystery of what happens to Annie. So like I said, so we can use these Tribune characters. And so I was talking with Mike Curtis, the writer, and at first he was like, you want to do Annie? And I was like, no, I mean, I've done Annie. And he's like, and I was like, how about Brenda Starr? He's like, yeah, that could work. And then he said, how about Friday Foster? Now, Friday Foster may not be a household name, but Friday was the first Black character to get a major, like their own major syndicated newspaper strip back in the early 70s. And I'm a fan of the strip, and the artist on it is amazing, whose last name I still failed to be able to pronounce, Jose Longarun or something like that. And so I got to do, so we got to bring back Friday Foster, who had not been seen on the comics pages since 1974 when her strip ended, and reincorporate her into the modern comics world. And so that was fun. And the funny thing is, the son of the artist, so Mark Longarun, contacted me and actually ended up buying several of the originals from that.
Oh, no kidding.
Yeah. And it turns out the reason he was buying the originals is so his dad, after the newspaper strip, became a well-known painter. He'd already been doing book covers and stuff, but he also became a well-known landscape painter. And there's, I guess, a retrospective on him that's going to be happening in Barcelona next year. And so he wanted to have these to put in this exhibit on about his dad that's going to be in Barcelona next year. So that it's like I'm not hopeful about it, but it sure would be nice if I could go to Barcelona next year and go see this exhibit. So.
Well, we all have to break out of our houses first.
Yeah, right. And we have to get them to allow us. Other countries have to allow us back into those countries at this point too. But yeah. So I've been, it's like I love the old strips. I mean, I love comic books. I love newspaper strips. I mean, you can even see behind me, that collections of Wash Tubbs and Captain Easy, or Terry and the Pirates and stuff like that, or the Floyd Gottfrieds and Mickey Mouse. And it's like, I love the strips. So it's nice that as much as I love the comics, it's also nice that I got to, try the newspaper strip things a couple times and have some fun with them, because I love those things.
And I also see an Ajax behind you as well.
Well, that's not an Ajax necessarily. That is the Sinclair dinosaur. But yeah, people sometimes think that. Yeah, no. This is Simone and Ajax here.
Uh-huh.
My own characters, my creations, and that's little Ajax there on the thing. I can hold it up a little closer. He is a little small, 3-foot tall, cartoony dinosaur. But yeah, Simone and Ajax, I've been doing now this is their 30th anniversary from their first appearance of appearing in, like you said, that college arts magazine, Cadence.
Was that their first appearance ever?
That was their very first appearance. Well, their first appearance together. Ajax first appeared in a painting I did in one of my classes, where he actually didn't belong in it at all. It was just something was missing in this painting, and so though it went against the rules of the assignment, which I often was doing in my classes, I usually would be like, it needs something that doesn't quite fit these rules, and I'm going to do it anyway. So I put this little tiny green, dinosaur in the corner, peering around this little pillar or something, and it just sort of, for me, that's what made the painting work. And at the time, I somehow in my head got the names Ajax and Atlas confused. I was thinking Atlas, I was thinking Ajax supported the world, not Atlas. So so I was thinking, I was thinking Ajax supported the painting, so I called the painting Ajax Triumphant, but unaware. And the name just sort of stuck, and he sort of stuck, and just sort of kept doodling this little dinosaur. And at the same time, I, inspired by a cute girl in my statistics class who sat next to me, I started doodling cute girls in my notebook in my statistics class. And that eventually evolved into Simone. And I had this little idea for a 3-page story. I was trying to figure out, who do I, so I was thinking, we're gonna have a pretty girl, and she'll be talking to somebody about this philosophical stuff, because that's what I was trying to do at the time. And eventually I decided, no, Ajax, little dinosaur. I was trying to come up with, who to team her up with. So I teamed her up with Ajax, and they just talked about life for 3 pages. And somehow they just stuck around. I started drawing them on my Christmas cards. And eventually, a few years later, I was at the ProCon. There used to be a convention just for professionals. I was at the ProCon in 1994, where I met Rob Walton, who did a comic book called Ragmom. And, we hit it off real well. And a couple months later, he gives me a call, and he's like, hey, do you, I've got like 4 empty pages in this issue. Do you want to, do a Simone and Ajax story? And that's what kickstarted Simone and Ajax as a comic book thing. So I did that story for him, and somebody else saw the story and asked me to do stories for their anthology, and I just did a bunch of stories for them. So, they have stuck around in one form or another for these 30 years. And now I haven't gotten to do a whole lot with them in recent years, except for the Christmas cards. I always use them on the Christmas cards every year. But I'd been wanting to, and so I'd actually, even before the pandemic hit, I had been planning on trying to do a Kickstarter with them this year. Now, the pandemic hitting meant a lot of the other work I was doing slowed down, so that means I had a little more time to work on them. So yeah, so now I was able to launch just recently a Kickstarter for them. And I'm very happy that it's going well. It got funded on the first day, which would, and now I'm trying to build on that and adding stretch goals and things. So yeah, so I'm doing a brand new 128-page Simone and Ajax collection with it'll have over 100 pages of new Simone and Ajax comics that I'm writing, penciling, lettering, and inking on the boards. I'm still working on paper, and Jason Millay is doing the colors as he did on the previous series, because one of the first color Simone and Ajax comics appeared online around 2008, 2009 on the Comic Mix site, and that's when I teamed with Jason on those. And then IDW did this book collection that I was holding up here about 10 years ago of that version of it. But so yeah, it's pretty much this is the book of everything I've ever done in my career. This is the thing I'm most proud of. This one book here. This is my favorite thing I've ever done, because it's mine. It is absolutely mine. I wrote it. I created it. It's my own characters. If anyone takes any blame for anything in it, it's me. But yeah, it's just I just had a lot of fun doing it. I got to tell a lot of silly jokes. I mean, this is, Simone and Ajax at this point is a very silly comic, and I want it to remain that way, because the world could sure use some more fun right now and some more silliness. And so, and I've always wanted to do more with them, and I've tried a couple times to start up something that just didn't quite pick up. But yeah, this year I decided this is the time to do it. Some things have happened in my life in the last few years that have made me realize I want to make sure, that if I leave something behind me, I want it to be you know, I want to leave something more of what I really wanted to do. And, you know, and because like I said, inking, I've done tons of inking, and it's been great. You know, it's been a great career. I've gotten to work on a lot of great comics, working with a lot of great people. So I've been very, very lucky. You know, I mean, I spent 18 years on The Simpsons, 10 years on Fables, 10 years on Scooby-Doo. I've been very, very lucky. But I didn't plan on being an inker. I wanted to write and draw my own comics. So I want to make sure I get back to that. So yeah, so I launched this Kickstarter for, like I said, to be over 100 pages of new Simone and Ajax comics in there, 4 different stories, and there's gonna be a little collection in the back of various extra odds and ends that maybe the public hasn't seen before. And one of those that I'm gonna be including in this that people haven't seen before is that painting that I did back in like 1989 or whatever it was in college, where Ajax first appeared on a little pillar there. So yeah, and I'm gonna stick in some of the extra Christmas cards and some drawings. So yeah, I mean, and anybody who's looking to check it out, the easiest way, the easiest ways are go to my own website, pepoy.com, pepoy.com, and the first thing you're going to see on that site is a link to go to the Kickstarter. But you'll also see a link to go to Simone and Ajax's own page, which is at www.simoneandajax. That's Simone with an E and Ajax.com. And again, immediate link to the Kickstarter page. And on there, you can also see previews of some of the stories I'm working on with that. So if you want to check out what's going on with that, you can read the first 6 pages of the first 2 stories in there. And as I get a little further on the other stories, I will post previews on that. And if anybody's watching this after the Kickstarter ends and you think, oh gosh darn, I've missed it.
When does the Kickstarter end?
The Kickstarter ends on October 14th at noon Eastern time. So, you know, I'm guessing people might stumble across this even later. Sure. Still, go to my website, because I'm planning on rolling this over onto Indiegogo after that. So it'll still be up until the time I go to print on this book in January. It'll definitely still be live on Indiegogo at that point, and it may even, and depending on what's going on, I'm going to try to keep it going after that, and I'll probably try to set up some kind of a other way people can buy this after that. So yeah, so when, you know, just go to pepoy.com or simoneandajax.com. And you'll find either whatever link I'm using at the time, whether it's Kickstarter or Indiegogo or whatever I'm using to be able to get this book. I'm having so much fun with it. I mean, you know, it's like this is what I've want. You know, doing this is my favorite thing to do in comics. There's nothing else I'd rather be working on, as much as I've loved everything else. But so I'm hoping people will check it out if they want to. You know, if they want to know like some of the things it's been compared to. It's been compared to Bone. It's been compared to Cerebus, the Marx Brothers, Archie Comics, Carl Barks, Donald Duck stories, things like that. So if you like any of that kind of stuff, I hope you know you'll check it out and you know, think about backing it. And there's a lot of fun other rewards you can get. So, you know, hopefully can cause some of these bad, you know, some of these jokes and things, you know, just a few more smiles and chuckles in the world when we could really use them.
That sounds great. So I think that we're going to end it right there. I am going to be putting the link to the Kickstarter and to Andrew's site in the description on YouTube. So by the time you see this, you'll see that there, hopefully. And then I wanted to thank everybody for stopping by, and thank you very much, Andrew, for coming. And I appreciate the conversation very much.
Yeah.
And that's about it. So long, everybody. Thanks so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.